Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin, the book-by-book, author-by-author crawl through my Penguin Classic wall. We've lately been talking about anthology volumes that Penguin Classic has made, and a lot of my anthology volumes are all together on the shelf. So if we had been doing the Penguin Classic wall as just a normal library tour, and I've been doing 10 or 11 books in one video, we would have encountered them all together anyway, and that is what we are doing in slow motion here. So I've got two more anthologies to show you. The first one is from the 70s. This is Harold Isbell, who did a really valuable Penguin Classic volume called The Last Poets of Imperial Rome. There's the cover with a, say it with me now, Roman fresco. It's a damaged Roman fresco. Who in their right mind would think that this made an attractive cover for a book? I do not know, but one way or another. This is Harold Isbell's, he assembled and translated all sorts of Roman poets from all over the empire from the 2nd to the 5th century, people you will not have heard about until the very end of the anthology. At the very end of the anthology, Alcuin and especially Boethius start to make an appearance. But otherwise it's names like Marcus Aurelius Olympius Nemesius, or Claudius Claudianus, Decimus Magnus Ausonius. These are people who have rabid followers, but only about 10 in the world each. And that's what makes this so valuable, is that Isbell went through and found all of these things, curated them all together, and also there's a great amount of secondary material in here. He introduces each of the poets. He talks in his general introduction very valuably about currents of poetry, currents of literature as the empire moved on and became less homogeneous. So as the empire became more and more, you would walk in the streets of a city in Brittany and you would see not only dyed-in-the-wool Romans, but also all kinds of other people. And that subtly shifted the literary expectations, and all of those places, all of the far-flung outposts of the empire, had book markets of their own. So that's what makes this fascinating. It is another example of an anthology that I wish were 3 times as big. We have the material. It's just there was a bit of careful choosing here. I think, like for instance, one editorial change that I would make with this one, if it were up to me, I don't think this is made anymore. But if this came around again, one editorial change that I would make is, first of all, 3 times as much material from each of the authors included. Second, 3 times as many authors. And third, to make a little room for those, get rid of Alcuin and get rid of Boethius. They have their places elsewhere. So no matter how legit, how technically true it may be, I don't think many general interest readers consider Boethius a poet of the late Roman Empire. Even though he technically was, they think of him as the author of the Consolation of Philosophy. And you could make a big Boethius volume that, anyway. This is a strong recommend if you can find this volume and you're interested in the subject. The poetry is not all that good, and thankfully the translator here is not trying to make the very popular. You can tell, the reason you can tell this was in the 1970s instead of 2020 is because in 2020 the editor of a volume like this would be saying that all of these poets were the best poets ever, that they're better than any of the Roman poets whose names you know, that it's a terrible shame, etc., etc. Because hipsterism has found its way into every last corner of the 21st century. So if you don't know about something, it is de facto great. Fortunately, this translator never thinks to do that. He doesn't overclaim for any of these authors, and even in his very adroit translations, not all the translations are by Isbell. There are quite a few. Peter Green does one in here, the great classicist Peter Green, and their hands are tried. Many hands are tried, and even so, despite the best efforts of the translators, you can see clearly that these people were forgotten for a reason. And this came out, and around the same time, the Michael Grant Roman anthology that we saw, that I talked, we didn't see it because I was in the cemetery when I was talking about it, but around the same time that came out, and then years and years later, Penguin Classic came out with another anthology, and this is Roman Poets of the Early Empire. This is a classic case study of how to do a cover and how not to do a cover. Both of these were cheap to do. One of them is attractive and one of them isn't. Now this volume was originally thought up by Betty Radis at Penguin Classics before she died as a kind of an answer to both the Michael Grant volume and the Isbell volume, because the Michael Grant was largely dealing with the golden age of Roman poetry, Virgil, and Ovid, and Horace, and Isbell, of course, deals with the very much Bronze Age of it, very much later and very much lesser. And Betty Radis and a few other classicists connected with Penguin rightfully observed that leaves a large amount of territory with truly immortal works that are unanthologized. And this is a wonderful, wonderful volume. This is edited by A.J. Boyle and J.P. Sullivan. And it has a couple of names that you will not know. Most of you will not know Silius Italicus, for instance, or Valerius Flaccus. But it also has names that you will know, and that we're going to see in this, or have already seen in this Daily Penguin. You've got Juvenal, Martial, Lucan, Seneca, Persius, and Ovid. Ovid is in this volume. In little bits and pieces. What do we have, for instance, from the Roman poet Statius? We have a book from the Thebaid and a couple of bits and pieces from the Sylvae. For Valerius Flaccus, we have one book from his Argonautica, his version of the Voyage of the Argo. Juvenal, we have selections from the Satires. Martial, we have selections from the Epigrams. Lucan, we have selections from the Civil War. Seneca, we have a whole tragedy, the Trojan Women, his Trojan Women. And Ovid, we have book 1 of the Tristia, which is translated by Peter Green. Book 1 of a long work that Ovid did in exile. So a wide variety of stuff, all of them individually introduced with tons of notes. And so this plus the Michael Grant gives you a kind of anthology set of the literature of Rome. And not to beat a dead penguin, but it also opens the door for another volume. I'm always my mind is always thinking about gigantic Penguin Classic Deluxe editions that could be done. In a perfect world where Penguin had all the money in the world and didn't have to please anybody, could just make anthologies forever, for an eternity. We saw when we were talking about Homer that Penguin once upon a time did a volume of Alexander Pope, of Pope's Iliad, and they also did a volume of Dryden's Aeneid. So they are aware, editorially they are aware that translations and anthologies, we saw the Greek anthology, can be classics in their own right, regardless of what they memorialize or not. So I've often thought a big 1,000-page Penguin Classic Deluxe edition, the Poetry of Rome, in which you take the Michael Grant and this and the Isbell and sort of mix them together, expand it all, and give one volume that covers the poetic life of the entire Roman Empire in selections. I think that would be wonderful. But that would be one of many, on the list of many anthologies that I would like to see reprinted. For instance, the obvious example here that no one's even thinking to do is the Oxford Book of English Verse. The original Quiller Couch edition is a classic anthology on its own. It doesn't matter that you can look at it and say, well, gee, he didn't include enough women, or gee, he didn't include some major figures, or gee, this is an awful idiosyncratic collection. Of course it is. But it was also a bestseller and affected lots of lives. It was taught in a million schools. It is a classic in its own right. Penguin Classic should do a black-spined Penguin Classic paperback of the Oxford Book of English Verse, the Quiller Couch edition, with his original introduction, and maybe get somebody else, a poetry aficionado, to do an introduction describing its place in the canon. Same thing with the Shakespeare First Folio. Should also be a Penguin Classic. in its without doing the individual plays, you can do the individual plays too, but you should do the First Folio. But anyway, those are your Penguin Classics for today. They're the two more anthologies. I think that largely does it for my anthologies. They were kind of all together. I think we come to anthologies later on. We come to anthologies when we get to the Middle Ages, but we're a long way off from the Middle Ages. I think we'll be dealing with individual authors next. I think I said that last time, but I'm pretty sure this is the end of the anthologies. So I'm gonna wrap this up, and I'm pretty sure we will move on to individual authors tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.